for this as well. Okay, and let's see now that, okay, the participants are coming. Yeah. Let's give a minute or two for people to join us, and then we start.
How many do we have now?
We had, I think, just above 100 registered participants. And let's see how many woke up this morning to join us. Let's give them a few more minutes or a minute to will come online, and then we start. Yeah. Okay, there's still numbers are still increasing. Let's give them until 7:32, and then we start. Okay.
So how many are we sitting at now?
We are just above 20 now, Nirmala.
Okay.
But it always takes a few minutes for people to join. Yeah? They're probably still busy preparing their coffee or tea or whatever they drink early.
Yeah.
Let's wait one more minute, and then we start. Yeah, so that we can end on time. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we waited 2 minutes. Let's start, and people can will join if so. We are at 25 now. That's we will see how it goes. Yeah. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for waking up early again on this Friday morning, on this cold Friday morning in Durban. I'm very happy today that after a few data breakfast where we went a little bit global. We had speakers from Denmark, speakers from Canada. We come back to local speakers from our very own UKZN. Yeah, and today's speaker is Professor Nirmala Gopal, who is a professor of criminology. So we will have to behave today during the talk and not commit any nonsense. Her research is she researched a lot on school during her career on school-based violence in the disadvantaged community. She's rated. There's lots of publication in national and international journal, and she claims in her biography that she's strongly committed to lifelong learning. Yeah? And her talk is probably will address that probably as well. And also she claims in her biography that she enjoys challenging situations and credible debates. Yeah, and this is the reason why I thought that having a lawyer on my side on the panel might be a good plan. Yeah? And that's why I asked Janine Hicks to kindly assist with the moderation of the question. Yeah? And this is mainly because Nirmala would like you to engage as much as possible in this talk, and we would like to keep it as interactive as possible. Yeah, and most of you are probably expert participants in webinars, and and you know that at the bottom of your screen, in the lower dark bar, there is a question and answer facility that you're welcome to use to pose your questions. There is also a chat facility if you prefer, and Janine will monitor your questions, and after the presentation of Nirmala or during the presentation of Nirmala, try to cluster them in reasonable numbers, yeah, and pose the question to Nirmala so that we can keep it as interactive as possible. So Nirmala, thank you very much for being with us this morning. And Janine, thank you very much as well for waking up early for us this morning. And Nirmala, now it's your show. Yeah, people are not here to listen to me. They're here to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Good morning to the participants. Yes, and I want to reiterate, thank you for joining us on this colder morning. some may not regard this as cold, so thank you very much for that. I want to also thank Professor Francesco for inviting me to engage with you on online teaching and learning. I think the little bits that that Prof omitted is that although I'm a professor in criminology, I have a PhD in education, and hence my interest in education and pedagogy. And just on a lighter note, the reason I'm interested in lifelong learning is that I'm towards the end, I'm close to retirement, and I still want to learn. So I'm asking you to go on that journey with me as well. But on a more serious note, I think if you looked at the topic and you wondered why, if you wondered why this topic, and that is really the emphasis is on the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And I say that because I think by now all of us, or most of us, have been bombarded with online teaching, lack of data, challenges that students have had, challenges that teachers or lecturers have had. So I think there's huge amounts of literature and studies that have already told us what the challenges are in terms of the of going online. So I started off by saying, you know, it was the 2nd of April when our Vice Chancellor sent a newsletter to parents. And I think that that particular newsletter was really critical because we were in parents, students, teachers, were in a new space. And it could have generated a great deal of anxiety because people didn't know where to from here. How are we going to cope with learning, especially with teaching and learning? But at that time, and I think very wisely, the Vice Chancellor assured parents that every effort is being made to provision of online teaching and learning. And that is, of course, starting with the strategy for online teaching and learning. And I think at this point, it's important to note that online teaching was not, or is not, just moving your physical class online. There's a whole new pedagogy to online teaching and learning, hence the need for a new teaching and learning strategy as well. So about the same time, the university began to work tirelessly with a group of academics as well as the Executive Management Committee to ensure effective preparedness for this online teaching and learning. So we know across the country, across the world, universities were prepared, had different levels of preparedness to go online or to begin their online teaching and learning. We'd be surprised, or I don't know, we may or may not be surprised that nationally, we had some universities who had already gone online many years ago, so it wasn't as difficult for some national universities, including our own university, if some of us were unaware. For example, UKZN's online initiative began almost a decade ago, and I'm not sure how many of us come from a teaching space where we are interested in didactics, interested in pedagogy, interested in teaching approaches and methodologies. So I was one of them who followed the online initiative, but at that time, I think the online initiative focused largely on Moodle. The other, so one of the challenges, I think, about a decade ago is that the buy-in from staff and students was staggered. It took us some time to acclimatize to Moodle and other intermittent forms of intermittent digital platforms. But the whole UKZN's digital online teaching and learning philosophy was premised on the teachings of learner-centered philosophy. And I'm sure we are all aware, and it's been drilled and over-drilled, that the idea of education is to focus on the learner rather than on the teacher. So teachers are just the facilitators. And I think this was largely informed by Jean Piaget, a psychologist, educational development psychologist. And he talks about the learner as a unique individual, the relevance of the learner's background that should be taken into account when curricula, for example, are designed, and the increased responsibility for learning belongs to the student. So largely the motivation for learning comes from successful completion of challenging tasks. And some of us may be aware of Confucius's theories as well, especially the idiom that says, what I discover, I remember. So I think that is why largely we have moved into learner-centered education. Those of us who have some background in teaching and learning would also remember in the early 2000s when the basic education sector had taken quite a huge transformation. We focused on outcomes-based education. And I think the higher education sector was a little slower in terms of looking at outcomes and focusing on the student. So by extension, in all of this debate, across the country, the new buzz idiom became leaving no student behind. And I think that when we talk about leaving no student behind, we were very serious, not just from a social or an educational perspective, but also from a very deeply political perspective. And my own thinking around this is that online teaching provides the opportunity for us not to leave students behind. But I think online teaching also provides us the opportunity for deep learning, which is framed by Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy. Those of us who have written teaching statements will probably be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, and also the levels at which we must teach or learning should actually take place in order for us to understand where the students are reaching the outcomes that we have planned in our modules. So all of these philosophies, for example, Jean Piaget's philosophy of ensuring that the social, the cultural, and the political atmospheres form part of the curriculum, and then Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy also influences the curriculum, have been the hallmark of UKZN's ideation of a premier University of African Scholarship. And I think that took place actually around 2008 when the Teaching and Learning DVC's office was created, primarily to ensure that teaching and learning facilitates UKZN as a premier University of African Scholarship. And I'm not talking about the research here, I'm speaking specifically about the teaching. But of course, by extension, we know that our teaching should be research-led as well. So around March, we landed ourselves into this new normal or into this chaos, whatever we want to call it, and we knew that things had to change. And so during this period, the Global and National Higher Education Center was forced to reinvent itself. And of course, I think it was for good cause. For me, as an educator of almost 34 years, I was excited because I realized that students were now actually in some subtle way forced to become co-creators of knowledge. And it's something that we've been trying to do for almost 2 decades in the country. And I think in terms of being co-creators of knowledge, we realize that there will be greater transparency and accountability on all stakeholders. So that would mean the students, the staff, the management of the university, the professional staff included. And I think with this, with greater transparency and accountability, it also ensures, depending on our own pedagogical practices, that students are at the forefront of debating, analyzing, and critically assessing what they are taught, how they are taught, and what their own teaching and learning responsibilities are. And I think that has been a huge debate around the university for at least a decade, when we think about the dreaded student evaluations. It focuses on the teacher and not on the learner. And the evaluation has been criticized by many. Well, of course, I think we have different schools of thought on it, but I know there was one school of thought that criticized it because it lacked a section that spoke to the learning responsibilities. For example, how many hours does a student actually invest? How much of work does a student do on his or her own outside of the 45-minute or 50-minute lecture? So fortunately, UKZN was very quick to take up the online teaching and learning practices. And personally, I think we were able to secure a space on the national and global higher education sectors maps. And I based this on the Global World University, I think that's what it's called, on their reports. And I think many of us get those reports and we read what's happening across the world, around the world, but also what's happening at UKZN. And part of what we did when we started with this new strategy is that we incorporated rigorous international best practices into our own local best practices. And then, of course, initiatives at the commencement of the COVID-19 we started to publicly communicate this. And I think that was very important because we started to decrease the anxiety levels for all stakeholders at the university. And I think those of us who have been following the university communique would be completely aware of the university executive management's constitution and direction of the project with a great deal of expertise. And I think this expertise was strongly entrenched in the university teaching and learning office. But I want to emphasize at this point that online teaching, and I said this previously as well, online teaching was and will not be taking what you do physically in a face-to-face teaching classroom and dump all of that information online. It requires a new approach. It requires teaching pedagogies that take into account, for example, the culture of the student, of where students come from. What are their social backgrounds? What is the economic conditions of the country? What are the political emphases of the country? And I've said that also previously. So I think the political consciousness of the executive management committee, staff, and students drove this concept of online teaching with the appropriate vigor. And I think importantly was the fact that every student's needs matter. And this was regardless of race, gender, culture, geographic location, and other relevant variables. Those of us who come from or sat on the Executive Leadership Forum meetings would know that these were discussed at length and that the university was really committed to ensuring that students were not left behind. And of course, I think we must compliment the university for the new initiatives, for example, the geo-mapping. These are some initiatives that we've never seen before happening at the university. But also I think in addition to that, initiatives that could have taken place almost a decade ago were suddenly fast-tracked, and the kind of data that became available was so different, but the data allowed us to start making different decisions around teaching and learning. But I also think something that I observed is that a great sense of staff collegiality and cohesion started to appear. And I think that was an unintended byproduct. Those of us, or attendees and participants with a long history with the university and the higher education sector, may recall Craig Sudin's report on social cohesion that was commissioned by the then Minister of Higher Education, Lady Pandor, who was concerned, who was really concerned with the fact that social cohesion was not moving at the rate that we wanted it to at higher education institutions. And that was actually precipitated by the event at the University of the Free State. Some people may remember it, the others can read the report by Craig Sudin on social cohesion at higher education. So I think all of this, COVID-19 and the online teaching just brought all of that, facilitated that at a rate that we didn't expect it to. I saw colleagues come together and starting to share best practices. And I think in that process, it was not only no student left behind, but I think it was also no staff left behind. And I think it's important for us to recognize and celebrate these unintended consequences, because we've been trying to do this for a long time. So organically, cohesion at the university was a greater, and I think the further accomplishment for all of us, staff, students, and the management of the university. So in preparation for the exciting journey, but conscious of a degree of staff and student trepidation, staff began reskilling. And I know across the university, there have been a host of high-level training opportunities, either at the college level or at university-wide level. And these were mostly offered online. Sometimes it was the same people because, you could see from the participants. At other times, there were new people who had an appetite for the training. And this was evidenced by the large number of participants. And I'm sure in various colleges now, the training is ongoing, and it would be nice to listen to some of the training initiatives. Of course, we know that students had challenges, staff themselves had challenges as well. And I think a critical point to note is that, especially with less experienced staff, the probability of greater challenges existed. And I think that was partly why the university participated in dry runs, to ensure that when the main show started, we would have less challenges, both from staff and students. And I think we must also commend, and I'm not an ambassador for the university, but I think I want to be honest about this, that we must commend the university for putting its best foot forward in ensuring multiple support opportunities for staff and students, not just for the immediate application of the online teaching, but also for the longer term sustainability of online teaching and learning. Yes, I think the other bit that we probably have underestimated, or we've not taken the opportunity, especially staff and students, is the recognition of UKZN's well-resourced and established and vibrant UTEL unit, that is a University Technology Enhanced Learning unit. And I think it is actually during this period where the visibility has really increased. Their barometer has gone through the roof, I'm sure. And the UTLO, the University Teaching and Learning Office as well, has propelled the university's technology trajectory, including the presence of ICS. I think previously, well, I could be wrong, and I'm hoping that participants will correct that previously we saw ICS as a unit that would repair our computers. But of course, the functions of ICS is far more than just repairing our computers. So UTEL, if we remember, was established to provide a suite of technology-rich teaching and learning solutions and innovative pedagogies. I'm not sure how many of us are aware that they do have a special website. And if you go onto their website, you would have listened to their podcasts and a whole lot of videos that talk, for example, about scaffolding, blended learning, the flipped classroom approach. And I think it would be useful for participants to go, if you haven't yet visited their sites, to look at their sites. So I'm almost at the end of my talk, and I say that UKZN patiently waits to harvest the fruit of online teaching as staff and students become more familiar with digital technologies for teaching and learning. Undoubtedly for staff, unrivaled pedagogical responses and strategies are emerging. And I think we must not doubt the aptitude, the skills, the creativity that exists in both staff and students. And I think that it's a time where we are experimenting, and perhaps it's also because we are at home, we don't have, we are spending more time on our teaching and learning. And so we are coming up with far more creative ways, partly because academics get bored very easily, and I think they want to find new ways of doing stuff. And I think UKZN as academics are really, we must applaud them for their distinction in providing training opportunities. Staff within the university have done extremely well in helping each other with training opportunities, in working with large numbers of staff in terms of skilling and reskilling, using the existing teaching and learning platform, but of course with later technologies. And the university has also, of course, invested in teaching technologies that will enhance the teaching and learning. I want to end off by saying, you know, in 1824, Louis Braille realized the need for greater access to learning. And I think that is, for me, that's a good comparison in terms of where we are. We are now finding, and we have found ways in which we can reach a larger audience, not just for today, but for the future as well. And the picture, of course, is bigger. But we will close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And that is what Louis Braille's work did. Those who could access, who had the opportunities to access information, largely because of their economic situation. But his work, of course, was able to reach a larger audience, and for those who did not have the economic resources. And I think for me, the principle of Ubuntu becomes far more appropriate now. If I am not, then you are not. And I think this cuts across all religions, and let us embrace it so that our online teaching and our centuries of values will unfold. And ironically, all of this has been made possible by the coronavirus. And my last concluding sentence is, let us be the Apollo 17. I'm sure many would remember when they were in space and there were challenges and there was no way in which they could get any further resources. They had to make a success, and they did. They made a success during crisis with minimum resources. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave us there and look at our questions and answers. I think it's over to Janine or over to Francesco.
I just wanted to quickly thank you, Nirmala, before handing over to Janine for a very nice overview of the teaching, from the teaching philosophy to the practicalities of teaching and learning, and to the sort of revolution that COVID brought on us. Yeah, and we've seen it in teaching and learning, but we've seen it also in many other aspects. Yeah, no. So thank you very much for that. It was a very nice overview of the journey of UKZN, from the philosophical underpinnings to the more recent practical challenges and opportunities. Now, Janine, over to you. We have already some questions from the audience, and if, and please, again, I would like to encourage our participants to make use of the question and answer facility to engage with Nirmala in an interactive as possible way. Janine.
Great. Thank you, Francesco, and thanks, Nirmala, for that input, and good morning to our colleagues who've joined us. Francesco, first of all, there's a question, can we get a copy of the webinar recording? I'm sure, would you like to just respond on that quickly? We're going to be sharing that with participants from today's webinar.
Yes, if Nirmala is happy that we put it on YouTube, we will do it just after the webinar, just the time to upload it, and it will be online. And we will share then the link with everybody.
Great, and you'll note also that people have requested, just I guess as a resource space, the website details for the UTEL, so that participants can access the kind of resources that Nirmala was referencing, the blended learning, the flipped classroom, the podcasts, and the various resources that are available, that we can make those available online. Okay, great. Thank you, colleagues. And I note that quite a few participants joined once we were already quite well underway. But as Francesco has summarized, Nirmala has taken us through, as a starting point, that technical trajectory followed by the university from the initial announcement back in April to developing a strategy for online teaching and learning, to building more the emphasis on the pedagogy itself. What are the teaching and learning methodologies available, using primarily the platform that we have, the digital platform of Moodle at UKZN. A second core component that Nirmala was framing was how UKZN teaching and learning took leadership on this process, from developing and delivering staff training, from building dry runs and support for staff, really accelerating our UTEL and our ICS support mechanisms, but also the data level, that geo-mapping of where our students and our staff are at. We had to answer, I think, at least 3 times questionnaires on which of the digital platforms and tools we were comfortable with, which ones we required more training on. And I believe data collection on our students' own access challenges and needs, whether that was in terms of actual hardware of laptops or software and resources such as data. But perhaps we can zoom in our focus to the third component, and I believe Nirmala had stated up front in our initial chat, is for many people this journey is a familiar one, but what we would like to hear in this webinar is those really those personal experiences of the staff and hopefully students who are with us in the webinar today. What has worked? What have been some of the challenges and the successes of this journey for staff and students? I think particularly, I note that in our school, in the School of Law, we were directed through the wonderful training of Dr. Craig Blewett, and our focus was very much on this aspect that Nirmala was profiling of this learned-centered philosophy, this active learning, the student-focused and student-led process. So can we start there? No chats or questions are coming through, so can we pose that as a specific question? Can we truly say that we've embraced that active classroom pedagogy? Have we lived up to this mantra of leave no student behind? Have we embraced those cultural background differences, those intersectional challenges that many of our students are facing? We'd really love to hear from our colleagues who are online. Can we invite you please to click your Q&A tab. I see someone's in the chat room. Just if you can pop up. Thank you. Francesco has posted on the webinar chat. If you click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the link to the UTEL site. But would anyone like to either specifically pose a question to Nirmala or post a comment in response to that? Have we accommodated the cultural backgrounds and particular challenges, whether that's of class, gender, geographical location of our students? Have we embraced all the differences that exist across our staff body? Have we left any staff members behind in this accelerated rush towards digital teaching and learning? You know, I'm just going to keep on talking until someone raises a question. Please, can we, someone type up, use our Q&A function.
Yeah, just a group of around 50. I think if people want to raise their hands, we can give them the right to speak if they prefer. We are not so many that becomes challenging technically. So please, if you prefer to ask your question live, yeah, just raise your hands and we can give you we can allow you to talk. You click the questions.
I already had one comment. I think perhaps as a starting point, we're sharing some of our own best practice and tools and resources that we found useful in this quest to deliver online teaching. We've got a comment, Nirmala, that colleagues have found the training by Dr. Craig Blewett, you know, his ACT, the Activated Classroom Teaching, the ACT Online, that training on blended learning has been very useful. Nirmala, do you just want to respond on that or comment on how you see this tying in with some of these approaches that you referenced?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Janine. I also thought it was extremely useful, and I think Craig Blewett's, I think he has about 20 years of, either 10 or 20 years of experience in terms of online, it's called teaching with pedagogy. And I think that's a huge distinction between online teaching and teaching with pedagogy. And I also found it extremely useful. And that's quite an expensive course, but I must congratulate and commend the university for having invited Craig Blewett, having invited him to actually provide that service to the university. I'm not sure how many staff actually took up the opportunity, but also it was great. And I think in addition to that, there was a support group where you could send in, once you implemented the teaching with pedagogy, you could send questions and you would get responses to that. So I think that was really an excellent initiative. And I think going forward, it would be wonderful if we could have that kind of training maybe once every quarter so that staff could either rehearse their skills or those who didn't take the opportunity to undertake the actual training could do so. But I found it extremely useful. I want to agree with the participants.
And perhaps anyone else would like to come in there. You know, I can just speak as a fellow lecturer at UKZN, having gone through Dr. Craig Blewett's course. You know, the challenge then came of translating my delivery of legal coursework into blended, using our blended methodology, using our Moodle platform, but you know, then somewhat restricted either by the size of the class that I was teaching or the data challenges that many of our students have, you know, and trying to develop then teaching methodology beyond just posting Cultura videos. You know, I think many of us rush towards making our, you know, our PowerPoint presentations with embedded voice and Cultura videos, but it would be wonderful to hear from colleagues what challenges they experienced in converting the content of your teaching into these activated methodologies in a way that resonates with students and creates space for them to co-create their own learning, some of these wonderful principles that we were exposed to, but to what extent do we feel that we've been getting that right? Nirmala, perhaps if you've heard from colleagues who have had access to that data that the Teaching and Learning Office has been collecting from staff.
No, unfortunately, I didn't have access to the data, but I want to respond to your earlier comment in terms of the rush to start doing creative lectures, PowerPoint presentations, etc., having the voiceover. I think, Janine, for me, and I was part of management at the time, and I would listen to staff talk about it. For me, I think the most critical aspect is planning. So if you, and it takes a lot of time to plan. If you plan correctly and planning against your module outcomes. I'm not sure how many of us are aware that we have outcomes in our module outlines, and there's a possibility that there's no coherence, that we lack the coherence sometimes, or we forget the coherence between what we teach and what outcomes we are supposed to actually attain. So I think if the planning is really good, there's no need then to oversubscribe in terms of content. And that was one of the questions I meant to ask earlier, whether participants believe content is more important than teaching methods or approaches. So I think sometimes we may believe that the more content we provide, the more effective we are as teachers. So if you plan correctly, you can reduce a whole lot of content, and that frees up your space for information that's most critical. So that's the one thing I want to say. That's the first one. And then Mtokozisi wants to know, what are some of the strategies to use to change the mindset of staff and learners? That's a tough one. Somebody once says you can change laws and people will abide by the new laws, but it's more difficult to change attitudes. And I think I heard this about 3 decades ago. And 3 decades later, I think we still kind of like, it holds true. To be really honest, I think, yes, this is what I think. I think involve students, the engagement of students from the outset becomes very critical, even in terms of your strategies to use for online teaching. What I said to somebody recently is that we should take a sample of the student evaluation and analyze especially the qualitative comments. And if we analyze the qualitative comments across colleges, I think we'd be able to pick up some trends in terms of what works for students and what don't. And maybe that's a starting point. And then of course, involving students right from the outset in terms of preparing the module outline, but of course also making them understand. I think getting buy-in from students, where we are extremely transparent in saying, this is what the Council for Higher Education requires us to do. And I think it's a slow process, it's going to be a long process, but I think I'm confident that eventually we will get there.
Okay. Thanks, Nirmala. A few more points have come in. So thank you. Nirmala has stressed for us that mantra that we use in street law, actually, less is more. Not trying to overwhelm and congest our lectures with too much content, and the importance of planning and structuring, having a lesson plan, almost going back to old school technique of having a lesson plan structured to make sure that we're making most of that time. The question had come through, I think people and our staff particularly are very mindful of this economic barrier in terms of students' access to technology and the challenges that that has in our ability to deliver online teaching and learning. I know, for instance, one of my assessments that our students upload, a student had been waiting in this class, laptops and data, and eventually typed, you know, a 12-page assignment on his cell phone and uploaded it. So, you know, what are some of our strategies? What can we do to try and address that gap? That's one question that has been flagged. But I think, Nirmala, also if we can come up to this, I'm particularly interested in that last point that you've made about involving our students in developing strategy, accessing student evaluation. To what extent do you believe we've been able to engage with our student body and seek their input, either collectively as UKZN teaching and learning, and drawing them into the development of our online teaching and learning strategy, or in channeling feedback from student evaluations, perhaps at a college or school level, to us lecturers so that we can modify our approach? So those are two issues on the table, Nirmala, if you'd like to pick them at will. How do we close that economic barrier, that economic gap that is a barrier to online teaching and learning? And possibly related to that, how do we create a better interface or feedback loop of getting students involved in the revision and the finessing of that strategy so that we aren't leaving them behind?
So I'm going to take the first one. I think I'm going to take the one on student engagement first. At the moment, the way in which student works, it's usually at all, you know, the high-level meeting, it's the SRC that that represents students. And I think, for me personally, we need to widen the group of students that actually engage at higher levels. So either at higher levels or even at the level of the school. So in the school teaching and learning committees that we should have a greater representation of students. I'm not sure, and I don't want to lie about this, I'm not sure how various schools across colleges actually run their teaching and learning committee meetings. So I think perhaps that's something I usually like creating work for people. So I'm creating more work here. But I think, you know, that either the teaching and learning office or the teaching and learning deans should come up with some benchmarks for how we actually conduct teaching and learning committee meetings. For example, what should be discussed in those meetings? Should we be discussing curriculum content? Should we be discussing teaching methodologies? And if we should be, how many students or which students should we actually invite to be part of that conversation? I think leaving students behind with the initial conversation becomes problematic. And that could possibly be one of the reasons why we have the kind of protests that we have, you know, so often at UKZN. So at the beginning, when you're planning, and that could be in November of the previous year, when you're planning, you unpack your modules, your exclusion criteria, your academic monitoring risk, etc., etc. So you do a full rehearsal of what is expected of students, and then you ensure that that the students who are represented on those committees actually are accountable for transferring that information to the classes. So I think what's happening for us at the moment, and this could be universal as well, is that there's a breakdown between the amount of information that students have versus the amount of information that staff have. And I don't think that's fair. Students should be just as empowered as staff are in terms of rules and regulations. But the other thing that we must not be shy to say, and that is, and I speak from my own basic education background, is that reading is a huge problem for us in South Africa. We'd rather listen to information from somebody else, and we're not sure how credible the information is, rather than read the information by ourselves. That could be, and I think students, we could have a cohort of students who don't want to read and don't read the rules. And I think reading the rules become very important. And in that way, the engagement of students in these meetings become far more productive as well. So we give students agency, and in terms of that, I think then we start to encourage more and more students to take up, the idea of technology, teaching with technology, etc. And we could have a whole debate on student engagement, because that's something that's being flouted across the world now. How do we incorporate and engage students to a large extent? The old idea of, I'm not sure people are aware of Bowles and Gintis, the jug and mug method. The teacher is the jug and the student is the mug, and we pour into the student. We've come 50 years away from there. We know that students are far more empowered, but why are we not harnessing those skills that almost everybody has a cell phone, and that's technology, and they use it so effectively? Why aren't we bringing those skills into what we teach and how we teach? I think these are really critical debates that we should be having. Somebody wants to know here, Fundo.
The economic gap, the barriers, and access to technology.
I was listening to to a webinar the other day. Economic gaps, I think we must move away from the thinking that the economic gaps exist only in South Africa. It exists even in a country like the US. But the one thing that another thing that I must applaud UKZN for is the efforts that they have made in terms of ensuring that students do get the data, in terms of, they've made lots of arrangements. But of course we do it, and I think this is an occurrence anywhere and in anything. At least 10% or 20% will have particular challenges. And I believe in the Pareto principle that for 20%, we should not train the 80%. 80% of our students are on the train, but let's deal with the 20% who are having unique challenges. And I think for that, students must have agency, and staff should also collaborate with students in ensuring that the university is held accountable to ensure that the 20% that are having those challenges are actually catered for. So we've got to start thinking creatively. It amazes me sometimes that we are a university, we are a place where new ideas and innovations are supposed to emerge for society. And if we can't resolve issues like data and access to data, then I think we have some serious questions to ask ourselves. This is not rocket science. So I think we must, whilst we are going the extra mile, we must be able to resolve the challenges of 10 or 20% as well.
There's a further...
Okay. Sorry, Janine. Yesterday, we spoke about, I'm not sure how many read this. Dr. Nzimande mentioned the fact that some of our students across the country are being naughty and are using data using data irresponsibly. And I think part of it was what he mentioned was that students are using it to download movies and also going into undesirable websites. And I think this is where we also must teach our students responsibility. And that could come, longer term into having general education modules where we teach ethics, where we teach responsibility. The education is such an important commodity, especially in South Africa, coming from our own historical background. So now and I think those of us the students who are able to get into university must learn to appreciate it, become responsible, and use their own education to improve the country as well.
Thanks, Nirmala. There are a few comments. I think people are very interested in this issue of feedback from students in relation to the online. I see a comment from Karen, and also, Karen again, has there been an assessment of the learner or students since the online learning started? But I think you spoke quite passionately and articulate issues of student participation and student agency, both in our own formulation of module outcomes and module content, but as well as in the delivery of teaching and learning. There have been a few practical suggestions from colleagues around how to minimize data use, people pointing to methodology and resources available on our platforms, lesson activity, making content downloadable using text-based methods to minimize our data content. There are also the more radical suggestions that many people are calling from, placing pressure on the government to reduce the cost of data, so that this doesn't become, we don't have to talk about data privileged people and letting access to data be yet another privilege that, creates a barrier for many people in terms of accessing information. You stress the importance of access to information. Critical question around assessments. A lot of focus is on our teaching and learning, but what is the thinking around assessments? I don't know, Farahana, if there was anything specific you wanted to ask there, but Nirmala, does that trigger anything for you?
Yeah, I can see Karen Strauss's question as well. If my memory serves me well, there has been, I think there may have been an evaluation that was circulating, and I think this we must ask, we must ask the DVC Teaching and Learning if that has already happened, and to provide us with the results, because I think transparency is really important. And I think our staff are interested in, at least the first round of evaluation to see where are we still having challenges, what's working well, what's not working well. And I think from there we can only improve our system. So assessment, it's the cycle of implementation, or conceptualization, implementation, and then assessment or evaluation. And I think we must go to full circle.
Nirmala, then I think I see we're coming close to our end point, but I think two important points Dr. Tembin Keys and Farahana Hussain have flagged. How do we incorporate social integration in our online teaching? And Temba is asking, how do we ensure cultural awareness and diversity in online teaching? Can you speak to that? Social integration, cultural awareness and diversity in our online instruction.
Yes, I think when I mentioned that earlier, that would be largely incorporated in your teaching approaches, as well as the kind of content that one teaches. So you would have, depending on what your subject area is, you would have to, of course, then custom make it for your own content.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we've spoken to the points that had been flagged. Francesca, I don't know how we're doing time-wise, whether we can do a final call for comments or questions. Sorry, I see something's come up on the chat.
Sorry, my microphone was muted. I think we still have a few minutes. If there are some urgent questions, we can certainly quickly try to address them.
Okay. I see something's come through on the chat. We make assumptions that just because every student has a cell phone or a smartphone and relatively tech savvy, does not necessarily translate into the ability and skills to be able to learn online. That we have, third-year students who are struggling still how to use computers effectively, and the issues relating to research and writing and learning in difficult learning spaces and environments. How are we, and that our students are in fact struggling to learn without contact, being isolated from the university environment, being removed from perhaps residences where it's easier for them to study, thrust into home environments that are noisy and difficult. How do we assist our students, navigate that jump, Nirmala, from simply having a cell phone and being sharp, to being able to learn online, removed from a university setting? How do we assist them navigate that?
Thank you, Janine. So I think when I mentioned the idea of students having cell phones, etc., I think let's not undermine the skills that students have. And that was my real emphasis. The undermining of skills that students have. Students are not deficit. So I think it would be important if I was teaching a particular class where there were challenges with actually using laptops. I think the first thing I would do is start off by finding out how many, which student, well, not, and I think it's very important for me that that students don't feel embarrassed. So to be inclusive, there's particular ways in which teachers would approach particular subjects. So for example, find a creative way in which you find out the level of proficiency that students have with laptops. I think the important thing to remember is that you have a cell phone, which is usually that size, a small little thing, and then you have this huge laptop. Some of the commands are very similar. Students may just be anxious because it's a new setting. Remember, there's a whole psychology, and part of what Jean Piaget talks about as well is the psychology of learning. So there's a psychology in terms of how do you graduate from a cell phone to a laptop, for example. So I think knowing the profile of your students and being very attuned to students is really critical. So a teacher is just as important in terms of understanding the social, the cultural, the psychology of students. And I think making use of that information from your students and gradually moving them into a space where they feel more comfortable. I'm sure most of us understand this. When we're anxious, it's very difficult to perform at optimal levels. So teaching is about psychology as well. Teaching is about having really high EQ. For me, it's not really the IQ, it's about the EQ. How do I understand my class? How do I understand my students? How do I use students to buddy with other students where I can see the difficulties are happening? How do I create the space for students to come to me and say to me, I am having some challenges, and approach those students who are more secure or more confident to help each other?
Great, thanks for that. I think, we're faced with many challenges with that. I just think, from a law school perspective, when we have classes, in the region of 300, 350 students, to what extent are we as lecturers able to know, the diverse needs and backgrounds and contexts of our students? We last saw them at the midterm break, pretty much early on in the year, before we were able to really build meaningful engagement with our classes. So I think that's a challenge to us moving forward with online teaching and learning, is creating platforms and spaces to be able to deal with particular and individual student challenges. There's a very specific question, possibly we can direct it to our UTEL colleagues. Is our PhD business leadership available online? And does anyone have any information on how foreign students might be able to access that, or students outside of the country? Perhaps Francesco, we can direct that to a UTL colleague who can advise on our our PhD business leadership program. Nirmala, I'm not sure if you want to comment on that, that notion of building our teaching and learning around our students' needs within the challenge of a virtual classroom, but also the size and the scale.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. So Janine, I think the one thing we must not run away from, and that is online teaching naturally generates a lot of time from the teacher has to invest lots of time. And I think one of the ways in which we could do this is, we have consultation times. So group work with I've done this physically previously, and I don't think it would be difficult online. So you work with the support staff, professional staff, group your students into maybe groups of 30. That's manageable on your Zoom, and give them different slots where you just have conversations with them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be conversations around content matter, just getting to know them. And if you have 300 students, and if you do 30 per slot in 10 days, and do a 45-minute slot, in 10 days, you will have gone through your 300. So I think it's about being creative. What are the creative ways in which you invest in your students? And trust me, students want that kind of engagement. They want to know that my teacher is interested in. My teacher is interested in what my interests are. Mm-hmm. And especially during the time of isolation now, I think it will prove even better. It would be nice to do actually a pilot on that.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Perhaps Francesca, if we can just pull it back to, one of the unintended positive consequences Nirmala spoke to, that being about staff collegiality and social cohesion among staff, as well as that the revival perhaps in our own teaching and learning of the practice of Ubuntu. And I think Nirmala's final comments there about tapping into creative means of investing in our students, reaching out to and engaging with our students, and deriving support at our college level in terms of methods and processes for doing that, whether it's smaller active tutorial sessions, but also just equipping staff as lecturers, supporting them and giving guidance on how best to do that, so that we don't just become little video creators and embedded voice note PowerPoint creators that we, slathering all over Moodle, but actually go back to building those not quite individual, but closer relationship and interactions with our students, so that we are tailoring our teaching and learning for individual needs of our students.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Janine, for so perfectly managing the discussion after Nirmala's engaging talk. Now, we started a little bit slow with the interaction, but then it picked up very nicely. Yeah? And what is very encouraging to me is that I think there is really need for sessions like this, where people have the opportunity to engage on this topic that are close to all our hearts, yeah? Because we are all facing this challenge. Each of us comes up with some solution that might work, and each of us should be encouraged to share it with others, yeah, who might be able to pick up some new aspect for their own teaching and learning. So Nirmala, thank you very much again for your time this morning. Janine, thank you very much to you as well for the moderation of the questions. And sometimes I forget to thank the people behind Data Breakfast, like Imara, Nelly, and Reine, who do all the necessary that the events are advertised and take place nicely. Yeah. So again, thank you very much to all of you for being with us this morning. We will probably in the course of today or latest Monday morning advertise the next Data Breakfast, and I wish you a good day, a good weekend, and in particular stay safe, because yesterday we had the highest daily increase ever, so it's better to be on the safe and healthy side of things. Yeah. So have a good day. yeah, good morning. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good day also. Thanks, Janine. Thanks, Francesco.
Thank you.